Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the FCCJ. Today we have a guest from India, Mr. Kumar Sundaram. Thank you for your coming.
Thank you so much.
Yes. He is an activist on anti-nuclear issue in India, especially that he is the youngest activist, very concerned about the network of the whole India organizations and movements in India. There are so many issues in India, but particularly that India and Japan civil nuclear cooperation agreement is most important issue just now, because next month, end of the next month means at the end of August, the new Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, is coming to Japan and will be have summit, and there are some questions about the agreement with India and Japan about nuclear cooperation. He will be, Mr. Sundaram is personally, I can introduce him that he is very young and he got BA from the Banaras Hindu University in Banaras, India. The university is my university, which I got my PhD from this university, and he's junior. And he got a diploma in the course of Japanese. It means that he can speak Japanese, but sorry that this time it is very difficult for him to speak Japanese. But he will be in English. I can introduce him. He is the most powerful and most important person for anti-nuclear movement in India, Mr. Kumar Sundaram, please.
Thank you so much, Sensei. And Chung-san and everybody who helped organize this press conference, I am really thankful. Sensei introduced me a little too generously. My name is Sundaram. I am associated as a researcher with Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace in India, CNDP. It's a coalition of grassroots anti-nuclear and peace movements which came about in the aftermath of the nuclear test in 1998. And it has been active for more than a decade now for nuclear disarmament and also with grassroots anti-nuclear energy protests. And these protests are happening all over the country. At several places where the government is planning new reactors, there are very strong, massive, but entirely, thoroughly peaceful people's protests in India and several parts of the country. In the southernmost tip of the country, you have a place called Kudankulam, which was recently in news for massive protests. Similar protests are happening on the western coast. You have a place called Jaitapur. You have Mithi, where American reactors are being set up. You have Kovada on the eastern coast, where Westinghouse reactors are being set up. So Indian government is one of the few governments which is going for a massive, massive expansion of nuclear energy after Fukushima, which is an aberration, which is an anachronism, because there's a global shift away from nuclear, as you would see post-Fukushima. Maybe I'll talk about it a little bit more later. I am here on a trip to mobilize solidarity against the proposed India-Japan nuclear agreement, which has been in pipeline for several years now. Apart from Tokyo, I'll be visiting Osaka for a conference in next 2 days. Then I'll be going to Hiroshima and also Fukushima. Then I'll be back in Tokyo. I'll join the Friday 8th protest in front of the Prime Minister's residence. So the idea is to reach out to as many people as possible, citizens group, activist groups, and to highlight what are the implications of this nuclear agreement for India and in general internationally. So very briefly about the movement. What are the problems with the agreement that we are trying to highlight? One is the problem nationally, one set of problems which pertain to problems in India, and there are other set of problems which highlight why this deal should be objectionable at an international level as well. On the Indian side, one has to understand that this is slightly more than being a bilateral deal. India, after 2005, after its nuclear pariah status was exempted and it was mainstream, as you would know, that there was an international embargo, a ban against having nuclear cooperation with India, which lasted for more than 35 years, which started when India conducted nuclear tests in 1974, for which it used the technology, know-how, human resources that it got under peaceful rubric from the West in 50s and 60s. So after that, there was a ban on India, which was lifted in 2005-2008 by the Bush administration. It helped India getting exemption from those restrictions. And after that, India has entered into bilateral nuclear agreement with a number of countries, including France, Canada, US, Russia, Nigeria, Kazakhstan. It's trying to have an agreement with Australia. So everything who has something nuclear, India is trying to have an agreement with that country. But the Japanese agreement is slightly more than a bilateral, as I said. Why? Because as of now, there is no concrete proposals of Japanese companies selling turnkey reactors to India. The Japanese agreement is important because very crucial components which Japanese companies manufactures are going to be used in American reactors, which are being set up in Kovada in Andhra Pradesh on the western coast of India, and Mithivedi on the eastern coast of India, where GE, General Electricals, is building 4 massive reactors. And as you know, both these countries, GE and Westinghouse, also require a bilateral agreement between India and Japan, because effectively they have become companies with major Japanese shareholding. So GE has become GE Hitachi, and Westinghouse has become Westinghouse Toshiba. The French company Areva, which is setting up a massive reactor, in fact, it is going to be the world's biggest reactor in Jaitapur in Maharashtra, western coast of India. It's very close to Mumbai, Bombay. There also, in that reactor also, some very crucial Japanese components in the valve, in the reactor vessel will be manufactured by the Japanese companies. So to facilitate, for these French and American reactors to take off on the ground, these companies require a bilateral agreement between India and Japan. And hence, these companies and their governments have been pressuring the Japanese government to have an agreement as soon as possible, because in lack of this agreement, their projects are stuck. Secondly, it's also very important because the whole process of India going in for so many bilateral agreements and for so many nuclear purchases had very little to do with the energy requirement, although it was peddled post facto as a justification for these deals. What happened behind these agreements is this, that Indian government, when it conducted nuclear tests in 1998, it faced another round of sanctions, right? And since 74 test, also it was under ban. So it wanted those restrictions to be lifted, and in exchange for these exemptions, it came up with advance purchase promises to all these countries to buy these reactors. So these reactors are being bought and being set up in India in exchange for legitimacy for India's nuclear weapons status. This is very, very important, because the 74 test invited bans and moratorium which lasted for more than 3 decades. But the 1998 tests, you would see that the response of the international community led by US was slightly different, because by then India had become a major consumer market for the goods of the American companies, because geostrategically, India was now more important in the Asian game of containing China and the war on terror, in which US then was indulging in Iraq and Afghanistan and all. So India was too important to be left out, and hence the 1998 test, in a total reversal, kind of attracted a different response, and there was a mainstreaming of the India's nuclear weapons. There was a legitimacy of Indian nuclear weapons. And because the Indian government, the Indian elite, was too attracted to becoming a superpower, becoming a nuclear weapons power, and becoming a legitimate nuclear power, that it agreed to have all these reactor purchases. And which brings to the question that these reactor purchases are happening in India without any cost comparison, without any real rational understanding of how much energy India needs and how much of it should come from nuclear and so on, without looking at the safety procedure and their implementation in a post-Fukushima world. In fact, India is one of the few countries which has further diluted its safety norms, because without diluting even the existing very loose regulator that we have been criticizing from beginning, it cannot implement these reactors on the ground. Similarly, the implementation of the new proposed nuclear power plants is happening by brutally crushing people's resistance on the ground. Because, as you know, India is a very densely populated country. There are farmers, there are fisher folk, and these are most vulnerable sections of Indian society. We have tens of thousands of people who are going to be affected from this insane nuclear expansion drive, and they are up in arms, totally non-violently. These movements are happening for the last 5-7 years, and not a single case of violence from the side of people's movement has occurred. So, very vulnerable, poor people, mostly from farmers, women, rural women, because their livelihoods are at stake. And whenever a family is displaced from village to urban centers, women, it's very difficult for them to cope up with a totally different cultural milieu. So you would see that in these grassroots movements, massive movements, women have played a very, very important role. And they have faced brutal repression. As we are speaking here today in Kudankula, more than 5,000 people are facing fictitious charges of sedition, war against the Indian state, which is absurd. Indian government declares anybody anti-national when you oppose a nuclear power plant peacefully. Apart from these big charges of sedition and all, very fictitious cases of murder, attempt to murder, destroying private property and so on and so forth have been leveled against absurdly large number of protesters, unnamed faces, not 10,000 people and like that. In Kudankulam, but also in Jaitapur, in Mithevirdi, in Chutka, everywhere. So the nuclear expansion in India is happening post-Fukushima in a totally anachronistic fashion, when there is a global shift or at least a rethink on nuclear issues. In Indian government, because its weapons are being legitimized, in exchange it is setting up these reactors, pushing them under the throat of its vulnerable people who are losing their livelihood, who have very, very legitimate concerns about safety of these reactors, like the French project in Jaitapur. It's a totally new design of reactor. It's an EPR, European pressurized reactor, which is nowhere else being built. The only place where building it is in Finland, where it has run into huge cost overruns, and the Finnish regulator after Fukushima has actually taken Areva to the court. They are fighting litigation there for safety issues. But in India, it's all okay. Similarly with the American imported reactors. So all these reactors are being set up by crushing grassroots protest, by further diluting the existing very, very loose regulatory norms, by further insulating the nuclear industry. The Indian setup has something called Right to Information Act, and it provided some access. You can put a right to information query to government departments as asked about their budget, their procedures, and so on and so forth. But there is an attempt that the Right to Information Act would be diluted and the nuclear sector will be granted a complete insulation from any public scrutiny. Similarly, in 2010, you had a system, we have a law, Nuclear Liability Act, which we have been critical because it's very loose and actually caps the limit of liability in case of an accident. But there is a very small hook on the suppliers, the foreign suppliers. The condition 17B says that in case of an accident, the operator can choose to sue the supplier. It has a right of recourse against the suppliers. And in case of the imported reactors, the Russian companies, the American companies, the French company Areva, all of them have unanimously said, no, we will not abide by this act. And the Indian government should amend the act, which is passed by the Indian parliaments. It's a question of sovereignty of Indian people. And when this legislation was under discussion in India, we had a very heated, very animated discussion, because in India, the whole governmental setup of dealing with an accident, large-scale accident, is totally unreliable. Even after 30 years, the victims of Bhopal, 1984, which was a chemical accident, much smaller than a nuclear accident would be, are still waiting for compensation, redressal, rehabilitation, and so on. So that was the backdrop in which the Nuclear Liability Act was legislated in India, and the foreign corporations are pushing that the government of India should should amend this act to accommodate what they think is their concern, that they should be let off. This Japanese agreement would, of course, further reinforce that demand. The government is under immense pressure. The new Prime Minister will be visiting US as well in September, and we are apprehensive that one of the key things which he would offer to US as a gift would be dilution of the Nuclear Liability Act. The earlier Prime Minister also tried his best to do that, but it's because it was a government based on, it was a coalition government which had parties, all sorts of parties, so it was very difficult for him to get it through in the parliament. But the corporate lobby this time believes that Modi government will be able to do that because he has brute majority in the parliament this time. So these are the concerns which Indian people have regarding the expansion of nuclear energy in India. And these are very, very genuine concerns. So you would see that not only at the grassroots we have protests. The grassroots protests are obviously, they stem from more immediate concerns of safety and livelihood, site-specific issues of safety of these designs, reactors, and so on. But in the general society, the intellectuals, the general civil society activists, and Democrat voices who are still ambivalent about whether we should go for nuclear or not, the larger nuclear question, but even they were stunned by the brutal repression that these movements had to face on the ground. Even they were stunned by the brutal denial of democratic space for these movements, by the brutal denial of transparency and minimum accountability. Even you would say that within the government, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, which is the highest auditor in India, raised very, very specific and very severe questions in the way nuclear regulation happens in India. Right? When the government was legislating this Nuclear Liability Act, secretaries from 8 ministries, ranging from Home Ministry to Health Ministry and so on, they said, we are simply not in a position to deal with a nuclear accident. So even within government, there have been voices critical of the way in which this expansion is happening, even if they might be in favor of nuclear, but this current model of expanding nuclear energy, there have been divergent voices within the system itself. You would also notice that the earlier Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, he was finance minister in early 90s in India, and as an economist, as a finance minister, he actually put the Nuclear Power Corporation to the book, and he said, he reduced their budget. He tried to make them accountable and more auditable. So, but as a prime minister, as a political head, it suddenly started making sense for him to give the Nuclear Power Corporation more leeway to go for further expansion and so on. So, the important point here to note is that the nuclear expansion in India is happening for pure diplomatic reasons, for pure diplomatic imperatives, and hence all the democratic norms, all the safety concerns, all the protests of the peoples at the grassroots and in the urban centers as well are kept at bay brutally. And But this has not really stopped the protests. The protests are even ongoing. When your Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, he visited India in January this year, we had very strong protests in several cities of India. Apart from these places where these villages where grassroots protests are happening, we had protests in Delhi, in Bombay, in Calcutta, in several cities, in Bangalore. And people came out and said, Mr. Shinzo Abe, you are welcome to India, but nukes are not. That was our slogan. And we had thousands of people coming and protesting against Mr. Shinzo Abe. So the protests are still ongoing. They are very, very strong. And we are against this insane, anachronistic, undemocratic, unsafe, unaccountable, uneconomic expansion of nuclear energy. And the agreement with Japan would be a disaster. It would also be a disaster in the sense that when the mainstreaming of Indian nuclear weapon status was happening between 2005 and 2008, led by and engineered by the Bush administration in the US, Japan was among the few countries which was still slightly reluctant to legitimize India. Despite objections of Japan and also a range of other countries in the nuclear suppliers group, like New Zealand, Australia to some extent, and several other smaller countries, the nuclear suppliers group granted an exemption from its own rules, which prohibited earlier any country prohibited from nuclear commerce if the country has not signed CTBT and NPT. So it will be a complete reversal from that diplomatic posture, and Japan granting legitimacy to India's nuclear weapons would be an ultimate embrace of this insane nuclear power India, nuclear superpower and whatnot in the international system. And it sets a very, very wrong precedent. It sets a wrong precedent when the world is concerned about dilution of NPT, when the world is concerned about how to deal with cases like Iran, North Korea and others who are further going for proliferation. And there are n number of there, at least the IAEA system says there are more than 25 countries who are waiting to proliferate. They have the wherewithals, they have the technology, material and everything. But the NP system so far, despite all its other limitations, it has been able to stop proliferation. But here in a world which is dealing with further proliferators, potential proliferators, which is dealing with cases like Iran, you have a country like India which is being rewarded for going nuclear, because it is close to the US-led international system, because it's an ally of the US. So you have good nukes, Indian nukes are good nukes, Pakistani nukes are bad nukes, potential Iranian nukes are bad nukes. So this deal, this process of legitimizing India's nuclear weapons creates fissure in the international NPT system itself, and it's a very, very bad precedent for global disarmament. So on both the counts, on the count of global disarmament, this is a bad precedent. This has very deep, worrying implications. And on the count of nuclear energy, it's pushing for an insane, expensive, dangerous nuclear expansion in India, which will unleash horror on the most vulnerable sections of Indian society, who are voiceless, whose voice are just not listened by the Indian government and the mainstream media and the mainstream society as well. Because in India, as I say, it's a third world country, and they're obsessed with a particular model of growth and national prosperity and so on. And for that, they think we need lots of energy, we need nuclear energy and so on. So on both these counts, the India-Japan agreement would strike a blow to the concerns that we have been raising, consistently facing state repression. It will create bad precedent. And apart from these concerns, I think also it should be highlighted that in the international system, post-Fukushima, when most of these big nuclear giant companies are facing losses, are forced in several countries to reverse their market share and so on, to reverse the expansion. And for instance, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland have mandated a reversal of their nuclear policy. In such an international scenario, India is now slated to become a rehabilitation place for all these nuclear corporates, and it will kind of provide a space to recoup their financial health. Areva is going to gain hugely from. Areva is a French company whose profits are dwindling over the last 5-7 years. It's in a bad shape financially, but the Indian deal is very, very important. So the post-Fukushima, I think the Japanese-Indian nuclear agreement would, in a very important and a very worrying fashion, would turn the clock back internationally on the expansion of nuclear energy post-Fukushima. It will provide a new energy to these corporates whose profits have been falling over the last few years. So for all these concerns, we have been strongly against the India-Japan nuclear agreement. These are concerns which have been raised by the people, the villagers of India, the democratic people of India. And when we had protest in India against Mr. Shinzo Abe's visit, we had friends in Tokyo, Osaka also, which came out and participated and joined our protest. So we have had very strong solidarity from the Japanese movement also. So it's not a question of Indian citizens, it's a question of both Indian and Japanese citizens. It's a question of citizens of other countries internationally who have come against nuclear expansion, nuclear power in general after Fukushima. So I would most humbly request you to help us in raising our voice, help us in reaching out to as many people as possible through your media. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Then you are okay with the 5 minutes left you have.
Okay. Okay, I thought I was too.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I should speak a little bit about the movements and these projects in India. I was slightly brief about them. So I was saying that the new projects which are being set up in India are being set up in a totally anachronistic fashion. Post-Fukushima, the government has further diluted the regulator. We have a regulator called Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, which is very ironical for its dependence for funds as well as human resource on the same department which is supposed to supervise, the Atomic Energy Commission. We have been, for a number of years, asking for a more independent regulator in India. But the government has been in complete denial. And even the recommendations of this very loose, very non-independent regulator have been kept aside. Last year, the government of India commissioned a reactor in Kudankulam, which is on the southernmost tip of India, and it is a Russian design. It commissioned the reactor despite huge protests on the ground. It commissioned it when one of the key directors of the company, Russian company, Atomstroyexport, was in prison in Russia for a huge scam which was related to supply of substandard equipment. Between 2005 and 7-8, some sub-suppliers of this company, Atomstroyexport, supplied bad quality equipments to batches which were supplied to Iran, China, and India. And we highlighted that this is the set of components which have come to India, and there should be a thorough independent investigation. So the government of India totally denied that. It commissioned that reactor when India needed better regulation. It commissioned that reactor when the AERB, as I said, is a non-independent regulator, but it came up with a 17 post-Fukushima recommendations specific to this Kudankulam site. This regulator came up with 3 reports. One had to do with pressurized water reactor, one had to do with heavy water reactors, and a different set of recommendations for the Kudankulam, specific. But in commissioning of the Kudankulam reactor, the government kept aside the recommendations of the AERB itself. The government kept aside the very basic norms of setting up a reactor. We had raised objections regarding the geological instability of the site. We had raised objections pertaining to the fact that the population in this area is very dense. As per the government's own rules, there should be no population within 1.6 kilometer radius of the reactor. But today, more than 5,000 people live in the 1.6 kilometer radius. It was ironical that these 4,000-5,000 people were relocated closer to the reactor when tsunami happened in 2004. The government's own stipulations say that there should not be more than 10,000 people in a 10-kilometer radius. But India is a country where in a 10-kilometer radius you would have 100,000 people, and you have them in Kudankulam. So we had these specific objections pertaining to this site, but the government kept them aside. And it gave clearance and started commissioning this reactor because of pure diplomatic reasons. President Putin has to visit India, and on that particular day, it was announced that the reactor will be commissioned. The Indian Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, visited Brazil this month, for the BRICS summit, and there he again invited President Putin to come to Kudankulam and to see that his reactor has taken off. But the worst fears about this site have come true. The reactors, despite the government's announcement that it has been commissioned, it is not generating a single megawatt of electricity. It is shut down for the last 3-4 months. They, in between, say to the media that it's functional, but the state grid, the Tamil Nadu Electricity Board, does not register any electricity coming from this reactor, which brings out our worst fear that the corruption which happened in Russia, which had to do with substandard equipments, has actually caused serious problems in the reactor. On May 14th, there was a massive accident in the reactor, not radioactive, but a release of fire, and there was a small explosion in which at least 6 people got serious burns. At least 2 people got more than 75% burns. So in Kudankulam, that is the situation. In Jaitapur, where French reactors are coming, similarly, in 2010, the government's Ministry of Forest Affairs was sitting on the application pertaining to the green environmental clearance for this particular reactor. And we had raised several objections. Independent environmentalists, even government's own working groups on environment in this geologically fragile area, because not only nuclear, there are several other projects are coming up. So the state government had instituted a environmental review committee for the entire area. That committee had itself raised serious objections on the environmental clearance for all these projects. But in 2010, when the French president, then Nicolas Sarkozy, was visiting India, just on that eve, the Indian government declared, okay, it's all safe and we are giving it green clearance in advance based on these 45 conditions, and which were really loose, which were not really conditions. And the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, he was a person with some conscience, so he went on record and said that we had to give them clearance for diplomatic reasons. So this is the whole story of nuclear expansion in India. All the environmental concerns are kept aside, all the safety concerns are kept aside, movements are brutally crushed. One of the first things which happened when the new government took over in this May was that the minister who is responsible for forest and environment said that these concerns will not be allowed to impede the nuclearization and industrialization in general in India. And within a week, he granted green clearance for more than 200 companies, 200 projects. So this is a government which is obsessed with a particular model of growth, which is obsessed with inviting and attracting foreign investment in India. And to attract this investment, you have to dilute labor laws, you have to dilute environmental laws, and the government is going full throttle about it. One of the first things which we saw when the new government took over was a report by the Intelligence Bureau, which is the highest body responsible for domestic intelligence of the government. It came up with a report naming us CNDP, National Alliance of Anti-Nuclear Movements, People's Movement Against Nuclear Energy. These are names of organizations which are spearheading grassroots protests, and also Greenpeace, some other activists like Medha Patikar, Praful Bidwai, Achin Vanayak. These are leading activist names. So it named almost a dozen organizations and around 50-60 individuals in its report, saying that these people are impeding India's growth. It used the term they are a threat to national economic security. So we have now become threat to national security. My name is also there in that report. So in general, when we address such meetings, we say, dear friends and dear chair and friends from the Intelligence Bureau, because they are always there. So this report criminalizes any sort of dissent. This is what is happening to anti-nuclear and anti-nuclear protests and protests on environment in general. So this is a very grim scenario in which we are trying to appeal to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. Then we will be invite question from working press first. Any person? Okay.
Michael Penn of the Shingetsu News Agency. I was just wondering a little bit about the background of how did you basically yourself get deeply involved in the anti-nuclear movement, and and how has it kind of changed your life as you have? I mean, obviously we have anti-nuclear activists in Japan. Many of them have come up, especially since the Fukushima issue. What was it that sensitized you to this issue in the first place, and brought this to sort of your top priority in your activism?
I'll definitely talk about. Do we take some more questions and then I answer?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. My own personal trajectory has been slightly zigzag, probably interesting. I studied Japanese language in 2003. I worked with some Japanese companies, but maybe I didn't like the corporate job too much, so I went back to campus to study. And I did my master's in Gandhian studies. I was maybe one of the reasons, which was also because I did some interpretations for Hibakushas when they visited India and so on. So that got me interested into peace and nuclear issues. But then I was concerned mostly about nuclear weapons. So I did my master's in peace studies. Then in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, I did my MPhil in Disarmament Studies, School of International Studies. I am still pursuing my PhD in the same department, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I used to write, I used to publish about nuclear disarmament issues generally, not so much about nuclear energy, but I was definitely aware of the weapons and energy connections. I had my own criticism of the nuclear energy projects and nuclear power in general. I worked with Pugwash India as a senior research fellow for 3-4 years. And it was then that Fukushima happened, and I thought after Fukushima, it's no longer, there's no point in being silent and only talking about peace in very abstract terms. So, and I was volunteering for CNDP since its inception in 2000. And I became slightly more active on the anti-nuclear energy front. With CNDP and individually, I visited all these areas that I mentioned. After Fukushima, I have also been active online because I got a lot of updates on Facebook and Twitter from friends in Japan. I also started a website which is called dianuke.org, on which I used to put all Fukushima updates, but later also I started putting everything related to nuclear, which I think might be useful for the Indian audience, and it has become a good online platform. So definitely Fukushima was very pivotal. It was a landmark in my own small private journey. And today I'm associated as a researcher and activist with CNDP. We organize solidarity at national level, solidarity for these grassroots protests. But in general, we try to intervene with the urban middle classes and citizens group and try to highlight nuclear liability issues, accountability, transparency. We try to reach out to people even who are not anti-nuclear per se, but they should obviously support more transparency, more democracy. So we work at several levels. We have our school and college outreach component as well, in which this month we have invited, and we are very glad that 2 people facilitated by Peace Board, 2 young students would be traveling to India and will be taking them to various schools. So the CNDP as a coalition is active at so many levels, and it has been a great learning experience for me personally to be part of it. Although the whole scene, because of the government repression, because of the lack of resources, because of the very, very fastly depleting support in the media itself, and that obviously has to do with the government repression, the situation is becoming difficult. But I'm sure we'll continue to fight on. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
If you could meet the Prime Minister...
Can you mention your name?
Yeah, my name is James Cole from University of Tsukuba. If you could meet Prime Minister Modi, I think he would ask you what kind of economic arguments would you make against nuclear power. And I'm sure you know that India mines a lot of coal, and this is also very destructive of the environment. So have you done any cost-benefit analyses of nuclear power versus other forms of energy, say also including solar and other kinds of energy that India might exploit instead of nuclear power? And then the second question is, what is the oldest nuclear reactor in India?
Which is the?
Oldest.
Oldest. Okay. The oldest nuclear reactor, I'll address the second question first, is Tarapur, which is very close to Bombay, and it falls in a very, very densely populated area. There have been several independent research on the radiation impacts of this reactor, but that has not led to any policy change.
How old is it?
It was commissioned in 1969. So, yeah. And it's the same design as Fukushima. It's GE Mark I reactor, where, you know, the spent fuel is kept on the top of the reactor, and it's very, very dangerous. It's a shaky building. It's still going on. On the economic arguments, there are two layers of economic arguments. One is the general comparison of the cost of the nuclear power versus the cost of other alternatives, specifically in the context of an emerging, developing country like India. And second, as I earlier mentioned, that the whole economic cost-benefit analysis is kept aside because the decision to set up these reactors is primarily diplomatic. So when we say this, we say that in Jaitapur, for instance, if we take the cost of what has happened in Finland, the reactor has gone almost twice the original estimated cost. The Jaitapur reactors, each reactor would cost at least 20 billions. Similarly, with the GE reactors in Methi and Westinghouse reactors in Kovada. So the specifically the imported reactors are going to be costing much more than the domestically designed NPCIL reactors. That is one. Secondly, even in India, where still there is not so much progress of nuclear technology, but it has happened elsewhere, solar technology. Solar and other alternatives are increasingly competitive, increasingly more economic than the nuclear option. Worldwide, this is the trend. And in a country like India, it makes more economic sense because Indian population, 60% lives in villages, where it is more feasible, more appropriate to have decentralized solar power generation. If you set up these massive reactors and then you have to set up large grids, the electricity has to be transported and there will be transmission losses and so on. So this whole 20th century idea of having major grids, having to transport electricity to a large, vast country like India, to these remote villages. And as you know, 40%, this is shocking, 40% of the Indian villages are still not connected to the grid. They have not seen a single bulb in last 60, 65 years of Indian independence. So when we are talking about electrifying India, when we are talking about providing electricity to India, we should think of appropriate technologies. We should think, more importantly perhaps, the appropriate model of so-called progress, so-called industrialization. In India, particularly for the villages, decentralized energies, agro-based industries, and decentralized forms of energy generation and consumption, smart grids, microgrids, suit better. And in the urban centers, of course, you would need some form of centralized electricity generation. But even there, the transmission losses are too much, the electricity theft is too much, and we have had massive movements against the coal-based power plants as well in India. So we, as an anti-nuclear movement who have to address the energy question up front, we had a process of consultation with energy policy experts, the entrepreneurs of green energy, and we have come up with our own alternative energy policy for the country, which takes into account the macro picture as well as the availability of resources and human resources at the grassroots. So we have been pushing for, along with the anti-coal movements, we have found commonality that we have to address and we have to come up with alternative power scenario, alternative power policy for India. There has been very limited success, but because, as I said, the vested interests inside the government are very strong, so they are not going to listen to us immediately. But increasingly, we are reaching out to people with an alternative conception of what India needs. Also, it's important because in the development scale, India is at a threshold. It's at a threshold of development where it can make real choices, where it doesn't have to go back, and so those difficult questions are just not there in front of India. So India is at a threshold of development where it can make real, more sustainable and more meaningful choices, and this we have been highlighting.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes.
Please.
Thank you.
Hello, Joël Legendre from RTL France Broadcasting. Thank you. Just a clarification, maybe you mentioned already, but I didn't get it very well. What is the current state of India-Russia nuclear energy cooperation? Could you elaborate on that?
There's very strong nuclear bonhomie between India and Russia. 2 reactors in Kudankulam, the Kudankulam site in the southern India, 2-3 sites were identified for rehabilitating Atomstroy Export, the Russian state company. One is Kudankulam, the other is Haripur in West Bengal, which is on the eastern coast of India. On all these sites, the government has already moved ahead with site identification, initial planning and all. In Haripur, there's very, very strong grassroots protest, so the plan has not really taken off. In Kudankulam, out of the initially conceptualized 6 reactors, 2 reactors are already complete. 1 is commissioned. This reactor 2 in Kudankulam is almost ready for commissioning, but it faces the same problem that reactor number 1 faces, namely the substandard equipments, the geological problems, the safety regulation issues, the inadequate water supply, and all these site-specific issues. So 1 and 2 reactors are ready. The Indian government and the Russian government have already had an in-principle agreement to implement, to start off reactor 3 and 4. Our major objection, apart from the other objections that I already mentioned, has to do with liability. The Russian and the Indian government entered into an agreement in 2008, just before the nuclear suppliers group clearance to India. And now the Russian company and the government insist that because the agreement with Russia happened before the Indian Liability Act came about, so Russian reactors should be exempted in toto from nuclear liability. And that's a big sticking point between Indian and Russian governments, the negotiations so far. The government says it has found some solution to it, but they're not forthcoming at all. We are demanding that the bilateral agreement should be made public. This is about a civilian reactor. This is not a military agreement. And the question about nuclear liability should also be made public so that everybody could know if you have addressed the liability issue. About reactor number 5 and 6, it's going to be much more difficult because the government experts themselves have now, after Fukushima, saying we should not have 6 reactors at one place and other objections. So that is the status so far between India and Russia. But as I said earlier, the Indian Prime Minister has officially invited Mr. Putin to visit India and to see Kudankulam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other question from working press? Then it's open to the table. Yes, yes, please.
Thank you. Come from India. My name is Jun Yasuda, and I live in the United States. My question is: you are connected to Gandhi's ashram, and this kind of action is needed. we are believed nonviolence movement. So Gandhi is one of great teachers. So I like to know what is your favorite word from Gandhiji.
You studied MA.
Yeah, I think in the context of the anti-nuclear movements in India, I have been really proud of the fact, and it's one of been great attractions for me, that all these grassroots protests have been thoroughly non-violent. Despite brutal repression from the police, they killed one person in Jaitapur. They killed 2 people in Kudankulam in 2012. But there was no violence from the side of people. And you would see that women particularly, in hundreds and thousands, they would come and they would protest before the police in totally non-violent fashion. The fishermen took their boats and they surrounded these reactors. They kept their boats around the reactor in the sea. This was a very, very interesting protest. You would see thousands of boats just outside the reactor on the seashore, but totally non-violent. So one of the major attractions, of course, apart from the post-Fukushima concerns and anxiety and so on, has been the fact that in India, the anti-nuclear movements have been thoroughly peaceful, thoroughly non-violent, Gandhian. The leader of Kudankulam movement, S.P. Uday Kumar, is a Gandhian himself. And he has managed to immerse himself among the people, and this movement has come about. So I think one reason why I am personally with the anti-nuclear movements, because it's non-violent and Gandhian. Gandhi, it's very difficult, because as a student of Gandhism, it becomes much more difficult to say something about Gandhi, particularly outside India. I firmly believe that the Gandhian concept of non-violence, and I think the Gandhian concept of non-violence is not just a technical priority of prioritizing peaceful protest over non-peaceful protests. It has to do with a very deep respect for life. It has to do with very deep respect for the people whom you're opposing. It has to do with a very deep respect for democracy, for power. Gandhi believed in decentralization of power. He believed in agency of every single individual. And to me, it's not just an abstract value, and it's not just a tactical preference of one model of protest over another. It has to do with very deep concern about the way you look at human beings, the way you look at the evolution of human as a species and society. So I think the Gandhian nonviolent, of course, we have several traditions of nonviolent protests in India as well as outside, but Gandhi strikes as a premier example, because, as I said, it has to do with a very evolved and a very humane understanding of us as a society, as a species.
Thank you. Question? Oh, yes, please.
I'm Shoko Hachir from 8-Bit News. I'm just curious, nuclear power plant is, it looks to me that it's much more about military power and like world power trying to fight each other. Like the Iran, like the countries, smaller countries that has a bad relationship with the US, they really want to have nuclear power plant, but they just can't because the negotiation doesn't just go well. So anyway, I'm curious, what does like international, like in the sense of like international relationship of like power relations, what does the world look like from like India's perspective?
Right. Thank you. I think nuclear weapons have been wrongly imagined as a currency of power in the international system. And this belief has been really displaced. It has nothing really to do with reality. So even if you are a realist, even if you don't put on the table any moral claims, even if you're a realist, you would say that in international relations, there have been instances where nuclear weapon have lost to countries which do not have nuclear weapons, where as currency of international negotiations, it's not necessarily that having a nuclear powers give you an immensurate edge in the negotiations and power play and so on. So even that linking of nuclear weapons with power is really, really misplaced, imagined. But whether imagined or real, they are perceived as currency of power by the ruling elites of so many countries, including India, which is an emerging country. When India got independence, one of the few things which the new Indian elite clung to was to have nuclear technology. Of course, also because it will give its nuclear weapons, but also in general there was an unquestioned support for big technologies, all the premier technologies. And that was believed to propel India into the first world and into being a great super international power and so on. So in India, the whole obsession or the collective national imagination of becoming a big power or becoming a nuclear power is very, very strong. So I must admit that when India conducted nuclear tests in 1998, there was a popular celebration of those nuclear tests, which we try to combat, which we try to make people aware. But in Indian context, nuclear weapons are perceived to be bestowing the nation with great power and great edge in the international negotiations. It's a continuing challenge for us. And internationally also it has been like that. So one of the reasons the anti-nuclear movements must be successful is to question this whole imagined and misplaced notion of power itself. I totally agree with you. And the fact that nuclear energy, which is peaceful, considered to be peaceful, is closely and inextricably linked to nuclear weaponization. So much so that in Iran, what is the Iran crisis? In Iran crisis, the basic thing is now going beyond the NPT big bargain. The US and other countries are believing, they are conceding that even the advanced civilian capacity is a potential deterrent, is a potential to build nuclear weapons. So the primary NPT bargain that you submit your right to to build weapons and you will be given peaceful nuclear technology is in some way in trouble in the case of Iran. So even they are now accepting the linkage, which is so clear, which is so in your face. And somewhere this points to the fact that the world has to move beyond the NPT bargain. It has to move beyond the present totally unjustified, immoral connection between nuclear power and international political power. It has to move beyond the misleading notion of civilian and peaceful nuclear power. So I think the world is going through a churning. And the governments obviously are interested in short-term solution. Like in some ways you try to have a deal with Iran and contain it. But we have to look for structural answers to these questions. And I'm glad we have friends active who are active to address these bigger questions, including Kawasaki-san of Peace Vote, who's here.
Thank you. Maybe we should be last question or two. The past.
Hi. My name is Dennis Riches from Seijo University. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about how India is dealing with the front end and the back end of the nuclear industry, the mining and the plan for disposal.
Very briefly, it's very opaque. The uranium mining happens under another company called UCIL, Uranium Power Corporation of India Limited, and there have been troubles. And this has all been documented by the independent experts, published in the medical journals, and so on. So there have been impacts of radiation around Indian mining sites, and the government goes on in a totally unaccountable fashion. The nuclear waste problem in India is in complete denial. The government says we don't have a waste problem, we'll have it only after 30 years. As of now, there are no nuclear waste repositories in India. The nuclear waste is kept at the reactor premises and it's piling up. In Tarapur, I'm sure we would have by now several hundred tons of nuclear waste, high level and low level combined. So in India, waste problem is increasing, but the government is in denial, complacency, totally unaccountable.
And the last and final, yes, Takeshi-san.
Welcome to Japan, Kumar-san. My name is Takeuchi. I'm working for Takushuku University. I'm teaching South Asian studies. And I'd like to ask you about, will you elaborate on nuclear liability law's future? I mean, you already mentioned the dilution of the law, but so how do you look at the possibility of amendment of this law, liability law, under the Modi's administration, which has absolute majority in the parliament, and so it is very powerful. But on the other hand, BJP itself supported to this this legislation, reflected by the nationwide criticism of Bhopal incident. So that how do you look at the possibility? And the second question is, it's not about energy, but it's a nuclear doctrine of India. It is said that Modi's government will revise the nuclear doctrine, but what is the point? Thank you.
I think these are very important questions. I'll try to answer them very briefly. On the nuclear liability issue, when the liability bill was under discussion in the parliament and there was an opportunity for us as a civil society players to intervene and influence the debate, we argued that there should be no cap on the liability. We argued that the supplier should be made liable. It was accepted in a very, very diluted fashion. So the Liability Act, as it exists today, is already diluted. Second major dilution happened, and it happened in a very absurd manner in 2011. The government came up with rules. Once the government in the Indian system establishes an act, it comes up with detailed rules. These are a separate set of legislation to implement the act. And these rules, they came up with 2-3 small dilutions. One is the liability period will be only for 5 years. So the company is liable only for initial 5 years, and if any accident happens after that, there's no liability for the suppliers. Secondly, there should be a prior stated agreement between the operator and supplier that the operator will use this right of recourse. Only then later you can claim. So apart from having an overarching law, you have to have liability provision in the bilateral agreements as well. That was also put together as a condition in the rules. And these dilutions happened in the previous government. It was hell-bent on doing that. I mentioned briefly about the last visit of the last Prime Minister to the US. What he said is, he did a reinterpretation of the Indian law, like Shinzo Abe is reinterpreting so many things. The Indian Prime Minister said, the act says that the operator has a choice to sue the supplier, and we will promise the US that the operator will choose not to sue the suppliers. But the American government did not agree to it because it was just a promise. The future government, some future government might choose to, and in case of an accident, there'll be public uproar, so the government will be forced to choose to sue the supplier. So the government, the Obama administration was not happy with Manmohan Singh's promise on a plate. They were not happy with the gift. As of today, as you rightly pointed out, the BJP, which was then in opposition, was fiercely critical of the nuclear liability dilution. It was not against nuclear power per se. Actually, it was the BJP government in 1998 which conducted nuclear tests. It's a Hindu fundamentalist party. So they believe in the bomb. They believe in massive nuclear expansion of the civilian type as well. But they were opposed to nuclear liability and any dilution because of people's pressure. But now they are in the government. They are faced with a similar destiny, and they will try hard to do this. I see it's not so easy for the government because of 2-3 things. One is they have majority in Lok Sabha but not in Rajya Sabha, the upper house of the Indian Parliament. So they have brute majority in the lower house. So until they have a majority in the second house, the upper house, which seems very difficult until coming 3-4 years, they will not be able to amend it. Secondly, there is a democratic pressure. They have been consistently opposed to dilution of this act. So it will be very, very difficult to do a U-turn abruptly. This year is 30th year. The accident in Bhopal happened in 1984, and 2014 is 30th year of that accident. So we are planning that anti-nuclear movements and the victims of the Bhopal accident, where again it was an American company, Dow Chemicals, which was earlier Union Carbide. They have changed the company's name, and now they say it was the other company, so we are not liable. So all kind of corporate tricks. So we are planning that we will join with the victims of Bhopal accident, and we will again highlight the question of liability and rehabilitation. So I think we'll keep building pressure from the ground. And the second question about nuclear doctrine is also very interesting. The Modi government, in its manifesto, the election manifesto, it had said that it will revise the nuclear doctrine of India. The doctrine which the government, of course, that was also a BJP government, which it adopted after the nuclear tests, said that India will maintain a minimum credible deterrence, that was one, and a no first use policy. So the Modi government, and Modi has been a very, very ultra hardliner even within the BJP, and that is why he was preferred. They wanted a real hardliner this time. And he has become Prime Minister. So he had his campaign, Prime Ministerial campaign. In his manifesto, he has said that he will do a rethink, a revision of both these elements of the doctrine, which might be initiated, but I see that it will face a lot of protest inside the government and outside the government. No first use has been very important even for tactical strategic regions for India's nuclear posture, and even people in the military would see some merit in maintaining a low-key posture, and it's not actually low-key because the build-up is anyway happening. So it's just a posture which gives India a little more credibility, which gives India a slightly different posture from Pakistan, and that is why it was able to ready all these governments to give it exemptions, for instance, in the nuclear suppliers group. So maintaining a more credible sounding, more responsible sounding posture helps the Indian militarists as well. So I personally, this is my personal opinion, that they would not go as far as making a total reversal of no first use policy. They might try, they might go halfway, but it's going to face a lot of difficulty.
Thank you very much. We already passed 4 o'clock. Once again, Mr. Kumar Sundaram, welcome to the FCCJ, and today very, very impressive and your presentation and speech. Thank you very much once again. And
thank you so much. I really thank you.
And I'd like to present 1 year honorary membership to you, FCCJ.
Thank you. I feel honored. I feel really honored.
Then it will be finished meeting. Thank you very much.
どうもありがとうございました、皆さん。